Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start. Welcome to the Canon Institute. I'm Isabella Tabarovsky. I'm the Senior Program Associate here, and it is my pleasure today to moderate our conversation with Sergey Davidis. I'm going to make a couple of announcements first, and then we'll start. So on Wednesday, April 24th, at 11 a.m. tomorrow, we are going to have a panel discussing the outcomes of the Ukrainian presidential election. We are bringing our senior advisor, Mikhailo Minakov, here. We're also going to have Balazs Yarabik and Lydia Zubitska. It will be a really, truly excellent panel. On Monday, April 29th at 2 p.m., another great event, Memory Laws in the Age of Populism, the Politics of the Past in Russia and Eastern Europe. We're going to have Nikolai Koposov, who wrote a definitive book on memory laws in Russia and Eastern Europe, with Kathleen Smith as discussant. And on Wednesday, May 1st at 3 p.m., another great event, a journey to the Gulag, film screening and virtual reality demonstration with Stepan Chernousek from Prague. A really amazing journey that he's made going to the Gulag up in Siberia, documenting one of the camps and then creating a virtual reality model so that obviously people who can't go can actually imagine what that was like. All right, on to today's event. Sergey Davidis is head of Political Prisoners Support Program and member of the council at the Memorial Human Rights Center in Moscow. He is a Galina Starovoitova Fellow on Human Rights and Conflict Resolution here at Canon right now. He was educated in sociology at Moscow State University and in law at Moscow State Law Academy. For many years, he was a participant and one of the organizers of the democratic opposition movement in Russia. His research interests are closely related to activities supporting political prisoners in Russia, and he studies the sociological and legal aspects of politically motivated deprivation of liberty, in particular in the context of world practice and international norms. Sergey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for possibility to deliver this information about situation with Russian political prisoners. I beg your pardon for my poor English, and I rely on your tolerance to it. I hope it will not prevent your understanding, but ask questions loudly and slowly. So let's begin. When we speak about the political prisoners, I mean the approach Human Rights Center Memorial uses. This approach relies on 2012 PACE resolution and includes both people who can be considered prisoners of conscience, according to Amnesty International approach, and the people who are persecuted, both obviously whose persecution is obviously politically motivated and either unlawful or ungroundedless. And we exclude from the number of political prisoners people who either applied violence against personality or called for violence to any religious or national groups. So, using this approach, we have at the moment in our list 263 political prisoners in our list of political prisoners. For sure, this number is not complete because we are rather conservative in our approach, and it takes time to include people in our lists, and we should study official documents of the accusations or sentences in order to include them. So total quantity of political prisoners in Russia should be considered 2 or 3 times more, at least 2 or 3 times more than we have in our lists. If we try to study, to consider this complex and heterogeneous phenomenon like politically motivated imprisonment in Russia, we can use different look at it from different points of view. For example, we can consider what groups are mainly persecuted. And we can single out different various groups from our total lists. There are some civic and political activists there. There are about 30 of them totally. I include in this quantity people, in this number, people who are persecuted for their criticizing of the authorities online, participated in protest rallies, or somehow else participated in uncontrolled by the state civic or political activity. In this number, we have two, it's better to say three, human rights defenders. You know, Ayub Titiyev, the chief of our Chechnya branch, sentenced to real prison term, been charged for possessing drugs, but for sure it was absolutely false accusation. And also we have case of Yuri Dmitriev, the head of Karelian Historical Memorial, which is persecuted, been charged with some sexual crimes. And we have a case of Crimean human rights defender Kuku, who is persecuted, been charged with participation in Hizbut Tahrir party. We also have two journalists in our list, Chechen journalist Jalou Digiriev, like Ayub Titiyev, he was charged with possessing drugs, and the plot of his accusation was absolutely absurd. But anyway, he has spent 4 years in prison and should be released soon after these 4 years. We have a case of Kaliningrad journalist Igor Rudnikov, who is charged with extortion from the General of Investigative Committee of Russian Federation. It's unimaginable, absolutely unimaginable that he has done it. But anyway, he is in prison awaiting for the trial. There are some people who are persecuted for the realization of the freedom of assembly. There are 7 people in our list whose persecution somehow connected with this right. Very important and large group, which can be singled out from our list, are Ukrainian citizens and residents of the Crimea. There are about 50 representatives of this group in our list, but in this number includes 24 prisoners of war, but total quantity of Ukrainian political hostages for sure much more. I explained that that our lists are incomplete, and we often do not have access to many cases, especially to terrorist or espionage cases, but we can evaluate this quantity as not less than 100 people. Some of these people are unlawfully prosecuted for their legitimate actions, or in connection with them. For example, Andrei Kolomiets, who was persecuted for his participation in events at Kyiv Maidan. Or members of right sector nationalist Ukrainian organization. A few of them who dared to go to Russia were arrested and sentenced to various prison terms. For sure, it's unlawfully, but they were persecuted for some real activity. A lot of Ukrainians are persecuted just randomly. They are taken as Ukrainian citizens and are persecuted, being charged with absurd crimes. The most prominent case of this kind is case of Nikola Karpyuk and Stanislav Klich, who were abducted from Ukraine, tortured for months, and at last sentenced to 20 and 22 years in prison for participation in Chechen war on Chechen side. It's obviously a fake accusation, and they became defenders in this process just because the Russian state managed to catch them. Or case of Sergey Litvinov, Ukrainian citizen who is probably not completely psychologically well, and he declared that he participated in some military crimes during the active phase of Donbass war, but it's rather obvious that that it's not right, and there were no proofs of his participation, and the most part of this charged were dismissed, but the state cannot state that it made a mistake, so he was at last sentenced been charged with robbery for 8 years and a half, but he is also absolutely a random person. And there are equally random people been persecuted. These are people who are persecuted for or convicted already of high treason. We have 4 of them in our list, and for sure there are more people who should be considered as political prisoners, being sentenced for high treason. But unfortunately, all these trials and the sentences are closed for everybody but their lawyers. But their lawyers are obliged not to tell anybody about the case, so we cannot study the case. And very numerous group, a set of groups being persecuted, are the representatives of religious minorities. Actually, 186 people of total number of 263 in our list are persecuted in connection with their religion. But they do not constitute real single group because there are so different groups among them as Jehovah Witnesses or Hizbut Tahrir party members, Scientologists, or followers of Turkish theologian Nursi. And Jehovah Witnesses, participants of Tablighi Jamaat and Nursi's followers are persecuted as the members of extremist organizations. And Jehovah Witnesses is the largest group of this kind. Totally about 150 of them are persecuted at the moment, and not less than 60 of them are either in custody or under house arrest and are considered as political prisoners by Human Rights Center Memorial. But Hizbut Tahrir members are persecuted as members of terrorist organization without any real grounds, and there are more than 260 people in prison deprived of their liberty with the charge of participation in Hizbut Tahrir party. And we see the trend of growing average term they got. And for example, the maximum prison term we see in these cases is 24 years already. This sentence was delivered in Ufa last year. For sure, this restoration states for restoration of caliphate, and they do not support human rights in our understanding, but they do not use violence and do not call for violence. They are devoted to peaceful achievement of their strange goals, and we have studied dozens of cases. Nowhere there were no signs of violence or ammunition or any discovered attempts of terror plans or something like that. So they are sentencing just for participation in this organization, and the Russian Federation is the only country in the world which considers it a terrorist organization. And the problem of this organization is especially severe in the Crimea, because mainly Crimean Tatars are persecuted with these charges, and it looks like discriminatory persecution of representatives of disloyal ethnic and religious group. And we see some signs that not even all the people who are persecuted are really members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. This accusation is just used for suppression of Crimean Tatars. And as a second important aspect of the persecution in the Crimea is that this organization is legal in the Ukraine. So they became criminals just due to and after the occupation and annexation of the Crimea. And according to the international laws, they even participate in Hizb ut-Tahrir, act legally. And thirdly, the persecution of inhabitants of Crimea, in the way it takes place, actually violates international humanitarian law, because occupying state has no right to replace all the courts and legislation of the occupied territory, and people who are persecuted and arrested cannot be exported from the peninsula. But we see that all the mentioned phenomena take place. This brief survey of vulnerable groups brings us to speculation about the aims the state has persecuting these groups. And it seems so that these aims are rather diverse. For sure, in some cases, the main aim of the authorities is to prevent or stop legitimate activity of civil or political activists. But even in these cases and in many other cases, we see that actually the aim of the state is to scare the society, to send it is the signal about the behavior the state considers undesirable, to frighten people. And we see that even if we consider the total quantity of political prisoners something about 1,000 for the country inhabited with 140 million people, it gives anyway selective level of repression. And it seems so that it's very important for the state to send these signals. So it persecutes a small and unpredictable proportion of protesters who go to protest rallies, or of people who criticize authorities in social networks, but nobody knows whether he proves to be a victim, excuse me. And if we look at the persecution of Ukrainian citizens and many other people, we see many other random people, we see that probably the aim of this persecution is to confirm some thesis of state propaganda. It also concerns persecution of many Muslims, persecution of people who are charged with espionage or state treason. The state confirms its thesis of Russia being a besieged fortress in the ring of the enemies, of hostile Ukraine, the threat of Muslim terror, and so on. These threats should live in public conscience, and state propaganda delivers it, and they should be confirmed by some actual sentences. For sure, when we speak about the mechanism of persecution, we should understand that it happens rather seldom that persecution of certain people is orchestrated on the very top level of the state. Usually, officials of very high level just send some signals to local law enforcement bodies on the regional level, on the local level. And on this level, they compete in persecution according to understood signals. As they interpret these signals, they try to achieve better accountability, rewards, and promotion. So persecution, politically motivated persecution, is rather uneven on the territory of Russian Federation. And at last, we can look at the tools used for politically motivated persecution. Actually, there are about 50 various articles of criminal code used for persecution of people whose names are contained in our lists. And for sure, there are not only political articles, so-called political articles of criminal code. For sure, in the absence of independent court, any article can be used for falsified accusation having obvious political motivation. But there are some obviously political articles of criminal code, or some articles that are commonly used for restriction and violation of fundamental human rights and freedoms. Since Russian state pursues to be independent of civil society, and it doesn't allow free elections as an instrument of public control, it's very important for the state to suppress all the rest channels of feedback from civil society. It mainly concerns freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. And the state directs its efforts to suppression of these freedoms. If we speak about the freedom of peaceful assemblies, the most blatant violation of this freedom is the Article 212.1 of Criminal Code of Russian Federation. It punishes for repeated violation of the order of organization of public event. If you have 3 violations of this kind within half an year, and these violations have been punished according to the administrative code, the 4th violation is considered, of the same nature, is considered as a crime. And it can be punished by the prison term up to 5 years. there are many formal legal contradictions in this and violations of fundamental legal principles in this article, but even not speaking about the details, we can pay attention to the fact that the violations mentioned actually can be of any nature and cannot be even not be a violation, be the violations it's themselves. For example, if somebody participates in solitary picketing and another person comes up, it can be considered to be collective picketing, which should be preliminary accepted by the state, so it becomes a violation and person gets an administrative punishment. And if you have 4 violations of this kind, you become a criminal. We had only one sentence according to this law, the sentence to Ildar Dadin, and due to his brave behavior and fight, and due to public support, at last his sentence was cancelled 2 years ago, and our constitutional court explains that this article should not be applied mechanically, that there should be some dangerous social consequences of the violations in order to apply this article. And it hasn't been used for 2 years. But unfortunately, this year we again see that Moscow region activist, ecological activist Vyacheslav Yegorov was charged with this article, and since January he has been under house arrest. And his violations described and the documents of the investigative bodies are absolutely idiotic. We do not have too many time to describe them, but believe me, they are not violations. Also, very important tool for persecution of the people who participate in the peaceful assemblies is Article 318. It punishes for violence against police officer, but the practice of its usage is that when it's rather difficult to get official authorization for public event, if it's political protest event in Russia. And when people are not able to get such an authorization to get the bid accepted by the local authorities, they can peacefully go with their right to participate in unauthorized protest rally. And usually such actions are dispelled by police forces in spite of the fact that they are peaceful. And during this process, where a lot of people are peaceful people are attacked by police, there are some clashes, and it's difficult to understand even what happens. But after that, some police officers declare that they were beaten. There were no traces on their bodies. There are no objective confirmations of the harm they suffered. But there are no footage of these blows. But after each huge protest rally, we have 1 or 2 people accused of beating police officers. And at the moment, we have at least 2 of them in prison, 3 of them in prison, because courts are not objective, they are obviously biased, and they believe only evidences of police officers and not evidences of defense. And freedom of assembly can be punished even by more sophisticated and unexpected way. I should mention one case more, case of Rostov activists Mardasov and Sidorov. They organized collective picketing with some social demands in 2017 and arrested during this picketing and charged with preparing of mass riots. The plot of investigation is that they organized this unauthorized picketing, understanding that they should be arrested by police and expecting that their supporters will come to release them and will fight police, and so mass riots will take place. But they organized this picketing, they were arrested, nobody came for sure to release them, there were no mass riots, but they are in prison for a year and a half, and for sure they will be sentenced. If we speak about freedom of expression, there are some obviously non-legal articles in our legislation, in our criminal code. This is Article 184, beyond of other things punishing for so-called insulting religious of religious feelings. In fact, it punishes for blasphemy. It's not used very often, but anyway, everybody remembers the case of Ruslan Sokolovsky, who was persecuted for catching Pokemons in the Orthodox Church. We have Article 280.1, punishing for the calls for violation of territorial integrity of Russian Federation, and it is really this article is really used. It's especially blatant if we look at the comparison of our situation with Ukrainian situation. If Russian state calls for separation of some territories of Ukraine, if you just discuss possibility of secession of some territory of Russian Federation, you can be persecuted and imprisoned. And the new case of this kind is the case of Bashkir activist Ayrat Dilmuhametov. He just wrote an article discussing possibility of breaking existing federal federal pact uniting Russia and signing new federal federal treaty. Just the idea that Russian Federation in public discussion of the fact that Russian Federation can be peacefully reunited on other grounds is considered to be a crime, and he was immediately taken to custody just for that. And we have also an article 354.1 punishing for denying the facts established by the sentence of Nuremberg Tribunal. It's also is used rather seldom, but it's obviously dangerous. Unfortunately, we do not have too long time. Oh, yes, absolutely not. So I should only say that freedom of expression is also and very widely violated by Articles 280 and 282, punishing for calls for extremist activity and inciting hatred against some social, religious, and national groups due to very vague understanding of notion of extremism in Russian legislation and unclear notion of social group. police or complex group of consisting of the president of Russian Federation, they and occupied, like it was in case of Rafis Kashapov, sentenced to real prison term. Everything can be considered to be a social group. And the fact that Article 282 is partially decriminalized is for sure we should greet it, but it's not a decision because it's still in our criminal code, and in practice we see that it's often replaced by Article 205.2, punishing for justifying justification of terrorism and calls for terrorism. And punishment supposed by this article is much more severe than the punishment which should take place according to the Article 282. And the last point is the freedom of association. It's the trend of the last few years that the state increases the pressure on any independent self-organization, especially on the organizations which are somehow connected with foreign countries. And not only, but also, especially again this country. We have articles punishing for organizing or maintaining activity of extremist organization. We have article of organizing and maintaining terrorist organization, and they are widely used not only against real extremists and terrorists. For sure, we do not include them in our list, but against some social and political activists of having opposition ideas, and the cases of new greatness or art подготовка, which even doesn't exist actually, other cases of extremist organizations, fake extremist organizations, and the cases of State network or bars are obvious cases of fake terrorist organizations. As for bars, it's not a well-known case, but 5 Orthodox monarchists are charged with an attempt to secess Kaliningrad region from Russian Federation and incorporated in the European community by inscripting something on the walls and roads. It's a very idiotic plot of accusations even. And for sure there are a couple of articles which are illegal by their nature. I mean articles punishing for organizing activity of undesirable organization. The notion of undesirable organization itself, an institution of this organization, are absolutely illegal and vague and ungrounded. Nobody knows why some organization is called undesirable. And in case of and this article was sleeping for 3 years, for more than 3 years. But this year we have faced its awakening. There are already 3 activists of Open Russia, Открытая Россия, led by Mikhail Khodorkovsky movement. One of them, Anastasia Shevchenko, is under persecuted according to this law. Anastasia Shevchenko is under house arrest, and 2 other activists are persecuted, being free at the moment. And the article punishing for violation of some obligations connected with the status of foreign agent organization are also punishable according to means of criminal code. At the moment, happily, we do not have people persecuted according to this. And speaking about the trends, I mentioned one trend, the increasing pressure on civil society. I mean pressure on any attempts to self-organization. It's became much more much wider last time. The second trend is more widely used tortures, more blatantly used tortures. It was not so systematic in political cases earlier. The next trend is the growing number of political prisoners, especially of political prisoners whose execution is connected with their religion. And the fourth trend we can see is, as I mentioned, about Hizb ut-Tahrir, but it concerns all the political prisoners. Generally, the growth of average prison term sentence courts deliver. Thank you very much, and excuse me for so long.
No, it's excellent. A lot of information. So we're gonna have questions and answers while people are collecting their thoughts. I'll ask a question. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know how these things work. But I'm wondering how does eventually the situation with Ukrainian prisoners gets resolved? I noticed you used the phrase political hostages, and it sounds like that's what they are. How does that get resolved? Are they going to be used as hostages in Russia's relationship with Ukraine? Is there a way to extradite them to Ukraine so that they, what happens there?
Actually, we do not have very good expectations connected with our authorities and their goodwill. They do not have any goodwill, and they have just arrested 24 prisoners of war, absolutely unlawfully, and their persecution violates a lot of international obligations of Russian federations, the Third Geneva Convention, and so on. But they do it, and
you're talking about the sailors, right?
I mean
sailors.
The sailors, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but they are prisoners of war, and the only possible decision actually is exchange. And we had two cases of exchange when Nadezhda Savchenko and Afanasyev and Salashenko were exchanged to some Russian and even Ukrainian citizens, supporters of Russian revolt and so on. It's possible, and the Ukrainian side constantly offers this exchange. And actually every day in Moscow near the administration of Russian president, there is solitary picketing demanding total exchange of all the Ukrainian prisoners in Russia to all the Russian prisoners in Ukraine. But unfortunately, at the moment, Russian state doesn't agree.
Okay. Let's see. What questions do we have in the audience? Will?
You raise, Will Pomerantz from the Kennan Institute, you raised the interesting question of kind of informal practices from the center to the regions, where they kind of give signals, but they don't necessarily give orders in terms of what crimes to enforce, who to go after, etc. I was curious if you can describe in a little bit more detail these types of signals. Are they based on quotas? Do certain regions take the initiative themselves? What are the signals from your perspective that leads to these cases?
I think there is a combination of factors. Sometimes there are some rather vocal signals. Sometimes there are real quotas, and sometimes there is obvious initiative. Anyway, they have some formal accountability when they should open and investigate some extremist crimes, some terrorist crimes, and before Article 282 too was partially decriminalized, it was especially remarkable that in some regions, unexpectedly, we have sufficient surge of these crimes. It was rather obvious local campaign. They decided to increase their accountability. For example, in Barnaul region, it was especially notable in August of last year. And it was one of the reasons why they decided to decriminalize it, because when this article became not the tool for maintaining stability, but just a tool of accountability of local law enforcement bodies, actually violating stability, because, for example, then we had official protest rally in Barnaul against this practice, which has never happened before. They had to decided to decriminalize it, and in many other spheres, we see that situation differs from region to region. It's much worse, for example, in Krasnodar region or Rostovskaya Oblast, Rostov region, than in some other regions. So it depends on both on supreme will, but also from local level.
Okay. Any other questions? Please, right here. Please wait for the microphone and introduce yourself and ask a brief question, please.
Yes, just a question, no comment. My name is Inchi Bowman, International Committee for Crimea, Washington, D.C. here. In 2017, 2 Crimean Tatar political prisoners were released, and Akhtam Chigöz and Ilmi Umerov. And the release was arranged by the Turkish President Erdogan. And in return, what the Russian government got, 2 agents, Russian agents, who were in prison in Istanbul. Apparently, they had killed Chechen leaders, and the Turkish authorities caught them, and they were in prison, so they let them go. And what do you know about this case? I don't know what happened. And hopefully this is not an example to be followed, because 2 innocent people were released in exchange for 2 criminals.
I know only the same information you mentioned. Actually, I didn't mention this fact as example of successful exchange because it was not public, as previous cases were, as cases of Savchenko and another case was. But yes, it's so. It's difficult to comment somehow.
Okay, Kathy, right here.
Kathy Kosman. I was hoping you could also describe a bit more about the extremism law, which has been much criticized internationally also. As far as I know, the Russians have just dug in their heels, and the extremism law does not even require use or advocacy of violence. And as you well know, it's been widely applied also to religious believers, and that's my other question. There were many amendments to that and other laws passed in, I believe it was 2014, which basically opened the door to criminalization of, or at least making administrative offenses of unregistered religious activity of any kind, which of course would include, among many other groups, evangelical Protestants, unregistered evangelical Protestants who, of course, have a large following in this country.
Actually, we have too short time to describe everything in details, and I think that situation with Russian anti-extremist legislation, which is very vague and rubber, is rather well known because it's rather old situation. The problem now is that counter-terrorism legislation is getting some features of that only anti-extremist legislation used to have earlier. But you are absolutely right. It's a huge problem that we have such an anti-extremist legislation. And as for this new religious legislation, I spoke only about criminal persecutions. And this law happily doesn't impose new criminal responsibility. Administrative responsibility differs from criminal code. So yes, it's another unpleasant step restricting freedom of religion for sure.
Can I just ask, why is it that it's Jehovah's Witnesses that find themselves victims in particular of this persecution?
It's a very difficult question because, as you know, even Putin one day declared that he doesn't understand why they are persecuted. And actually there are no obvious reason to persecute them. They are innocuous, they do not threat the authorities, and the persecution even cannot be used in state propaganda, like they used, for example, persecution of some Muslim organizations. I think it's a mistake from rational point of view, and they probably will try to correct it, but it's rather difficult now to do it now, because anyway two stages of national judicial system have already accepted this decision, and since the claim is in European Court of Human Rights, I hope, probably I'm too optimistic, but I hope that when European Court delivers a decision, for sure in favor of Jehovah Witnesses, the state will get possibility and will use it in order to change situation.
I think there was a question right there.
Rosie Berman, I'm with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. My question is about whether Russian citizens have been prosecuted for criticism of Russian foreign policy, particularly in Ukraine and Syria.
Yes, for sure, there were a lot of them. I just will mention two short questions. One concerning Ukraine. I mentioned Rafis Kashapov, Tatar national activist, who was sentenced, as I remember, to 3 years in 2014, probably, just for reposts criticizing official Russian politics against Ukraine, especially in Crimea. He called for public support of Crimean Tatars and so on, but he didn't call for violence. Anyway, he spent all his term in prison. And the second example concerning Syria, Tumen's blogger Alexei Kungurov was sentenced to, as I remember, 2 years term for criticizing Russian military operation in Syria. He was charged with justification of terrorism, in spite of the fact that he is communist and for sure is not doesn't support any ideas of Muslim terrorists, Muslim state. But anyway, he also have already spent his term in prison.
Okay, any more questions? So I actually want to ask you a question about legal representation for political prisoners. I met once, I believe, the lawyers who worked with Yuri Dmitriev, and they were telling me that they didn't even have access for a while to information about his case. And that seemed, obviously, from the American perspective, so strange. How does that work?
It's unusual situation, actually. Anyway, state tries to make defense difficult, to erect some obstacles for normal legal defense, but when lawyers insist, they can get access. I actually do not know the exact details. Probably it was, probably they meant the fact that they cannot have access to the material of a criminal case before the court. Yes, it's so organized so in Russian legal system that defense and defendant can get information about all the proofs in criminal case only before the case, after the end of investigation. And during the investigation, they cannot have. It's our legal system.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we will end here. Let's thank Sergey for the excellent discussion.
Thank you very much.